We go to Psalm 95. For the Lord is a great God, a great king above all those other beings that aren't real. Paul believed that demons were real. He quotes Deuteronomy 32 to make the point. And there, in Deuteronomy 32, these demons are Elohim. The Elohim are real. Otherwise, you'd have to deny or disagree with Paul. Good luck. Now, I've come to, I'll put it this way, I have come to think like a biblical writer on this. The gods are real because the text says so. So I had to come to the point where I'm not going to elevate my tradition or elevate the way I've been told to think about a particular verse when it violates the text. But let's just try to embrace what the text says and see how that works. And it took me into all sorts of different places. I'm not going to click out to every one of these, but Psalm 86:8. Do you believe this or not? There is none like you among the gods, O Lord. Do you really believe that? Biblical writers did. I'll tell you what the biblical writers didn't believe. They wouldn't be meaning this. There's none like you among the beings that we know aren't real, O Lord. There's none like you in the non-existent vacuum. In other words, for God to get any glory out of these kinds of statements, the comparison has to be meaningful. He has to be compared to something that he can be compared to, We go to Psalm 95. For the Lord is a great God, a great king above all those other beings that aren't real. You are better than beings that aren't real. Believe it or not, you're better than Captain America. You're better than Iron Man, even though it hurts to say that, because Iron Man was my favorite growing up. You're better than Spider-Man. Fill in the blank. You're better than a fictional character. You know why? Because you're real. They're not. They're made up. So do we really believe this stuff that the text says? Is the Lord a great God and a great king above all gods? Yeah, he is. But to make that a meaningful statement, you have to allow the text and the biblical writer that God inspired to consider that the gods were real and they are inferior to the God of Israel. Otherwise, the statement has no meaning. And there's a lot of statements like this. There's a truckload of them. Let's just go down to this one. I think this one has the most punch, really. This is Deuteronomy 32, and this afternoon we're going to go back a little bit to verses 8 and 9. That's going to be our focus. But Deuteronomy 32 is, in short form, the rehearsal of Israel's history. They leave Egypt. God delivers them from Egypt through the hand of Moses. And, they go to Sinai, and then they fail in Numbers 13 and 14, because they're afraid of the Anakim. And then they wander around for 40 years, and eventually they become idolaters. Okay, the period of the judges. All this stuff. We know the story. And Deuteronomy 32 is a short form. But you get to verse 17, sort of in the middle of that story. And here's what it says. They, the Israelites, let's just turn on our interlinear here. They sacrificed to demons. The word there is shadim in plural. These are not demons like you think of in the Gospels. Again, I don't think we're going to get into that today, maybe in a Q&A. But that's not what these guys are. A shade comes from Akkadian for shadu or shadu. It refers to a number of things, but one of the contexts it refers to is a territorial entity. It's a being that has power over a certain area. Okay. And that's what these guys are because of verses 8 and 9, but I don't want to spoil this afternoon, so I'm not going to scroll up there. But the Israelites wind up sacrificing to these deities in other places, other nations that are not Israel. How do we know? Well, they sacrifice to demons, not God, I mean, the God they should have been sacrificing to, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to sacrifice to these idiots over here, okay? To deities, oh, look at that, the words Elohim again. They sacrificed to other Elohim they had never known, to new ones like they just run into. You know, now that they're out of Egypt, they're wandering around, they encounter other deities that they have no history with. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, they don't have a history with Chemosh or, you know, this or that deity. But the Israelites seem to, you know, run into a new deity and they say, oh, let's sacrifice to that one. You know, I'm being a little flippant here, but there's a reason why we had the exile, and it's primarily idolatry. But look at that. The Elohim are referred to as shadim, demons. Why is this important? How do we know that you know, they really believe that they were real? Well, let's use Paul for an example. I think Paul's probably a good source. You know, and I think you'd have to be a sort of an idiot to say that Paul didn't believe demons were real, because he has some confrontations with. And you get to 1 Corinthians 10, this is one of the meat sacrifice to idols passages. The other one's 1 Corinthians 8, you know, where Paul says, who gives a rip? You know, we know, though there are other lords and gods out there that people call lords and gods, for us there's only one. Okay, so right away, he's not denying that the other ones are real. He's saying that they're not ours. And then he says, you know, because of that, you know, go ahead and eat the meat sacrificed to idols. You know, again, unless you have a weaker brother, then you need to, you know, defer your liberty and all this kind of stuff. Well, you get to chapter 10, and he's a little more concerned, and, you know, you can pick up any standard commentary on this. Paul okays in chapter 10 eating the meat if it's sold in the marketplace. Why? Because it is a step removed from the actual temple sacrifice, the actual ritual. What he's concerned about is participation in the ritual to these other entities. And look what he calls them. Does this sound like Deuteronomy 32:17? I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. Demons, not God. I do not want you to be partners with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Like, how many times does he have to say this? Are we provoking the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? And even that line, right down here, the Lord saw it and was jealous. Okay, what Paul's doing is he's quoting Deuteronomy 32:17-19. He's pulling out a few phrases from those three verses in Deuteronomy. Why is it important? Because Paul believed that demons were real. He quotes Deuteronomy 32 to make the point. And there, in Deuteronomy 32, these demons are Elohim. The Elohim are real. Otherwise, you'd have to deny or disagree with Paul. Good luck. Okay? I mean, you could do it, but don't call yourself an evangelical. Don't tell me you have a high view of Scripture if you're going to do that. I'm not buying it. Okay? You either respect what the text says, and Paul is very direct here. You have to deny Paul believed in, I mean, good grief, you know, other supernatural beings here. Quoting a passage that calls them Elohim, or you just, you know, or you accept it. You accept what the text says. You know, and I had to go through all these hurdles myself, you know, so I'm not like being a hard nose here against anybody. I had to go through every one of these steps myself. You know, and I asked myself, you know, at some point, well, okay, you know, why does this trouble us? Why does it trouble me? And the reason is pretty simple. It wasn't simple at the beginning, but it took me a few months, you know, and it finally clicked in my head. The reason I was bothered, that was the easy part. What to do about it was a little more difficult. But it's one of those things that when you see, it's like, this is so simple. How could you not figure this out, like, you know, months ago? It troubles us because we are trained as Christians, and just generally as Western people from, you know, the Judeo-Christian Western civilization tradition. We are trained to think, when I see the letters G, O, and D on a screen, or a piece of paper, our brains just default to, oh, the letters G, O, and D mean a specific set of unique attributes. God means eternality, omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, creatorship, sovereignty. We think that those attributes come from the letters G, O, and D, that they are inseparably related, because that's how we're taught. There's only one G-O-D, and so therefore if there's only one, then it must point to these attributes. Now the big problem is that the biblical writers did not think that way about the word Elohim. And if you're paying attention, you already know why. Because they use Elohim as a term of things that are not the God of Israel. If Elohim meant to them a list of attributes that are unique, they would never use the word of something else other than the God of Israel. That would be a theological contradiction if the word itself meant those things, but they don't do that. So what's an Elohim? Well, the God of Israel, we saw that, Psalm 82. Council members, okay, who are, again, lesser than the big G God, they're called Elohim. Gods of the nations, we didn't click out to this one, but this is a list of, or it mentions 3 deities, Astarte, Chemosh, trying to remember the third one. And there's a few deities mentioned there, and they're all called Elohim. Even the goddesses, by the way, are called Elohim. Like the biblical writers don't use the feminine form of the lemma, even for goddesses. Everything's an Elohim. Really? So like Astarte is ontologically, attributionally equal to the God of Israel? No biblical writer is going to think that. And in fact, it's impossible because you can only have one uncreated being. You can only have one eternal creator of everything else. By using the word Elohim, they're not saying that these other deities are the equal, the essential equal of the God of Israel. They're not saying that because they're not thinking in terms of attributes. How about the Shadim, demons? Okay, no, they're not on par with the God of Israel. But they're called Elohim, Mike. Yeah, I know. The problem isn't that they're called Elohim. The problem is that you're thinking when you see G-O-D, it's talking about a list of attributes. It's not. And this is the adjustment that you have to make.